The August sun hammered down on Atlanta with the kind of relentless fury that made the asphalt shimmer like water and turned every shadow into a refuge. It was 11 in the morning, and the temperature had already climbed past 95 degrees, the humidity wrapping the city in a suffocating embrace that made breathing feel like work. The Beltline, normally alive with joggers and cyclists and young professionals walking their dogs, stood eerily deserted. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the northern entrance of the bike tunnel beneath Ponce de Leon Avenue, fluttering weakly in the occasional gust of hot wind that swept through like a dragon's breath. Lieutenant Sarah Collins stepped out of her unmarked cruiser and felt the heat slam into her like a physical force. She squinted against the brutal glare, her green eyes scanning the scene as she reached back to open the rear door. The click of the handle was followed immediately by the sound of paws hitting pavement, and then Max was beside her, his ears already pricked forward, his dark eyes fixed on the tunnel entrance 200 yards ahead. The Belgian Malinois stood motionless for a moment, reading the air with that preternatural awareness that had made him legendary within the K-9 unit. His black muzzle twitched, nostrils flaring, and Sarah watched the subtle tension build in his muscular frame. She had worked with Max for 5 years now, and she knew every signal, every micro-expression in his body language. Right now, he was telling her something was wrong, very wrong. Captain Marcus Webb approached from the command tent that had been erected near the tunnel entrance, his face glistening with sweat, his expression tight with a frustration that bordered on fear. He was a big man, a former linebacker who had spent 20 years on the force, and Sarah had never seen him look rattled. He looked rattled now. "We've got a situation," Webb said, falling into step beside her as she walked toward the yellow tape. His voice was low, meant only for her ears. "Third victim in 72 hours. Same pattern. They go in, they don't come out. We find pieces of them, but never the whole." Sarah kept her eyes on the tunnel entrance. It gaped like an open mouth, a rectangle of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow the daylight at its threshold. The concrete walls on either side were covered in murals, bright colors depicting Atlanta's history and culture. But the artwork seemed obscene somehow, too cheerful for what that darkness had witnessed. "Tell me about the tactical attempts," she said. Webb ran a hand over his shaved head, wiping away sweat that immediately reformed. "First team went in yesterday morning, 6 officers, full gear, thermal imaging, the works. They made it about 60 meters before they started hearing things, sounds echoing off the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere. They couldn't pinpoint the source. Then Sergeant Holloway said he saw movement in the thermal, multiple heat signatures that disappeared before anyone else could confirm. They retreated to reassess." "And the second attempt?" Webb's jaw tightened. "Last night. We waited until dark, figured we'd use night vision, catch whoever's in there off guard. Team of 8 this time. They made it maybe 80 meters before the sound started again. But this time, something else. Officer Reyes said it felt like the tunnel was breathing, like the walls were moving. I know how that sounds, but Reyes is solid. 20 years, never spooked by anything. He came out of that tunnel white as a sheet and requested immediate leave. Sarah absorbed this information without comment. She had learned long ago that fear was a valid data point. Experienced officers didn't spook easily, and when they did, there was usually a reason worth investigating. She looked down at Max, who hadn't taken his eyes off the tunnel entrance. His tail was low but not tucked, his posture alert but not aggressive. He was reading the situation, processing information in ways human senses couldn't match. "What do we know about the victims?" she asked. Webb pulled a tablet from under his arm and handed it to her. First was a cyclist, 42-year-old male, regular on the Beltline. Disappeared Tuesday evening around 7. We found his bike about 30 meters into the tunnel, front wheel still spinning when the first responders arrived. His helmet was another 20 meters in, cracked, blood spatter consistent with blunt force trauma. No body. He swiped to the next file. Second victim, female, 37, personal trainer. She was on her usual morning run, disappeared Wednesday around 6 a.m. Running shoes found at approximately the same location as the first victim's helmet. Blood on the left shoe, no body. And this morning. Third victim, male, 51, retired military. He was walking his dog through the tunnel. The dog came out the other side alone, leash still attached to its collar, but the handle end was. Chewed through isn't the right word. More like melted. We found his phone at the 60-meter mark, still recording. He'd been live streaming his walk. Sarah looked up sharply. "You have footage?" Webb nodded, his expression growing even more troubled. 23 minutes of nothing unusual, then the screen goes dark. Audio continues for another 8 minutes, sounds that our tech guys can't identify. And his voice, just once, saying 2 words before the recording ends. What words? It's here. The heat seemed to intensify, pressing down on Sarah's shoulders like a physical weight. She handed the tablet back to Webb and looked once more at the tunnel entrance. The murals on either side depicted scenes of community and progress, of Atlanta's transformation from Civil War ashes to modern metropolis. But the darkness at the center of it all seemed to mock those images of hope. "I need the tunnel's blueprints," she said. "Maintenance access points, utility corridors, everything. And I want to know if there have been any modifications in the last year, any construction, any repairs, anything that might have created spaces that weren't part of the original design. Already pulled it." Webb gestured toward the command tent. "We've got engineers from the city standing by. But Collins, I have to be straight with you. The brass is pushing for us to seal the tunnel entirely. Pour concrete into both ends and call it a structural failure. 3 victims with no bodies and 2 tactical teams that came back traumatized. That's a PR nightmare they'd rather bury. Literally." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. And it had nothing to do with fear. Those 3 people have families. They deserve answers. They deserve to know what happened to their loved ones. "We don't bury problems in this city, Captain. We solve them." Webb held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's why I called you. You and that dog of yours are the only ones I trust to go into that darkness and come back with the truth. Whatever the truth turns out to be." Max made a sound then, a low rumble that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whine. It was a sound Sarah had heard only a handful of times in their partnership, and it always preceded something significant. She looked down at him, saw his nostrils flaring rhythmically, saw the way his eyes had narrowed to slits of concentration. "He smells something," she said. "Something the other teams missed." Webb took an involuntary step back. "How can he smell anything from here?" "The tunnel entrance is 200 yards away." Sarah didn't answer. She was already moving toward the yellow tape, Max keeping perfect pace beside her, his attention locked on that rectangle of darkness with an intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up despite the oppressive heat. Behind her, she could hear Webb calling for additional units to stand by, could hear the crackle of radios and the murmur of nervous voices. But her focus had narrowed to the tunnel ahead and the partner at her side. They crossed the tape, and immediately Sarah felt the temperature drop. Not by much, maybe 5 or 6 degrees, but it was enough to be noticeable. The tunnel entrance loomed before them, 10 feet high and 15 feet wide. The murals on either side giving way to plain concrete that quickly disappeared into shadow. She unclipped her flashlight from her belt, but didn't turn it on yet. Instead, she stood at the threshold and let her eyes adjust to the dimness. The tunnel stretched ahead of her, a gentle curve that meant she couldn't see the other end. The walls were smooth concrete. The floor a combination of asphalt and painted lane markers for cyclists. Emergency lights were spaced every 30 meters, but only the first 2 were lit. Beyond them, darkness. Max pressed against her leg, and she felt the vibration of another low sound in his chest. She reached down and ran her fingers through the fur at the back of his neck. a gesture of reassurance that was as much for herself as for him. Then she clicked on her flashlight, and they stepped into the tunnel together. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing unusual for the first 20 meters. The walls were clean, the floor undamaged, the emergency lights casting weak pools of yellow illumination that seemed to shrink as she moved deeper. The heat from outside had given way to a clammy coolness that made her skin prickle. Max walked slightly ahead of her now, his nose working constantly, his ears swiveling to catch sounds that were beyond her range of hearing. She watched him move, fluid and silent, and trusted his senses completely. If there was something in this tunnel, he would find it. At 30 meters, she found the first victim's bicycle. It had been moved to the side of the tunnel, leaning against the wall with an evidence tag attached to the handlebars. The front wheel was indeed still intact, the tires fully inflated. There were no signs of a struggle, no damage beyond a few scratches that could have come from the fall when its rider abandoned it. Sarah swept her flashlight across the walls and ceiling. The concrete was uniform, unmarked except for the occasional maintenance notation stenciled in faded yellow paint. She could see the curve of the tunnel ahead, the way the darkness seemed to thicken as the emergency lights grew farther apart. Max stopped suddenly, his entire body going rigid. Sarah froze beside him, her hand moving instinctively to her weapon. The Malinois' nose was pointed at the wall to their left, at a spot about 3 feet off the ground. She couldn't see anything unusual, just smooth concrete and shadow. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Max didn't move. His focus was absolute, his body a coiled spring of controlled tension. Sarah watched him for a long moment, then stepped closer to the wall he was indicating. She ran her flashlight beam slowly across the surface, looking for anything that might have caught his attention. And then she saw it. A crack, almost invisible, running vertically from floor to ceiling. It was so thin that she might have missed it entirely if Max hadn't pointed it out. She pressed her fingers against the concrete on either side of the crack and felt a difference in temperature. The left side was cool, normal. The right side was warm, almost body temperature. Sarah's heart rate increased, but her breathing remained steady. She had trained for years to control her physiological responses in high-stress situations. She pressed harder against the warm section of wall and felt it give, just slightly. Not solid concrete. Something else. Max made that sound again, the rumbling that wasn't quite a growl, and Sarah understood. The tunnel had been modified. Someone had created a space behind this wall, a hidden corridor that paralleled the main passage, and that space was occupied by something warm, something alive. She stepped back, her hand still on her weapon, and keyed her radio with the other. "Command, this is Collins. I found something. Stand by." Webb's voice came back immediately. "What have you got?" "Possible hidden compartment or parallel corridor. Wall modification approximately 30 meters from north entrance. Max is indicating heat signature and possible occupancy. Requesting tactical backup for breach." There was a moment of silence on the radio, then Webb's voice again, tight with urgency. "Backup is 2 minutes out. Do not engage alone. Repeat, do not engage alone." Sarah acknowledged the order and took another step back from the wall, positioning herself so she could watch both the hidden section and the darker reaches of the tunnel ahead. Max moved with her, his attention still fixed on the wall, his body language telling her that whatever was behind that concrete hadn't moved. The 2 minutes felt like 20. She stood in the semi-darkness, the beam of her flashlight creating a cone of illumination that seemed fragile against the pressing shadows. The silence of the tunnel was profound, broken only by the soft sound of her own breathing and the occasional distant rumble of traffic overhead. And then, gradually, she became aware of another sound. It was faint at first, so faint that she might have imagined it. A rhythmic pattern, Almost like breathing, but not quite. More like something large and mechanical, a pump or a ventilator operating somewhere in the darkness. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the curved walls in a way that made it impossible to localize. Max's ears rotated toward the deeper part of the tunnel, then back to the wall, then toward the tunnel again. He was tracking multiple points of interest, his nose twitching as he processed layers of scent information. Sarah watched him and felt the first real tendril of unease coil through her gut. The dog was usually decisive in his tracking, able to isolate a single target and pursue it with unwavering focus. This uncertainty, this multiple target behavior, was unusual. The tactical team arrived without announcement, 6 officers in full gear, moving with practiced silence through the tunnel entrance. Sarah recognized Sergeant Chen in the lead, a compact woman with 20 years of experience and a reputation for keeping her head in chaotic situations. Chen's team fanned out behind her, taking up positions that covered both the wall and the deeper tunnel. "What do we have, Lieutenant?" Chen asked, her voice low and professional. Sarah explained what she had found, what Max had indicated. Chen listened without interruption, then moved to examine the wall herself. She ran her own flashlight over the crack, pressed her fingers against the warm concrete, and nodded once. "Breach protocol," she said to her team. "Standard entry, 4 through, 2 covering." The team moved with the efficiency of long practice. 2 officers produced a compact hydraulic ram and positioned it against the warm section of wall. The others took up positions on either side, weapons ready. Sarah pulled Max back to a safe distance, keeping him close against her leg. "On my mark," Chen said. 3, 2, 1. The ram hit the wall with a sound like a thunderclap, and the concrete crumbled inward to reveal not a corridor, but a small chamber, perhaps 8 feet square. The flashlight beam swept across the space simultaneously, and for a moment no one moved. The chamber was empty, but it had not always been. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges in the concrete that might have been made by fingernails or claws. The floor was stained with something dark that could have been oil or could have been blood. In the center of the space, a metal grate had been pulled up from the floor, revealing a hole that descended into blackness. And arranged around the hole, in a pattern that might have been deliberate or might have been random, were dozens of shoes. Running shoes, cycling shoes, work boots, sandals. All of them worn, all of them matching general descriptions of what the victims had been wearing. But more than 3 pairs, many more. Sarah counted quickly. 18 pairs, 18 people. The tactical team secured the chamber while Sarah approached the hole in the floor. She shone her flashlight down into it and saw what appeared to be an old utility tunnel, perhaps part of the city's original infrastructure that had been sealed off decades ago. The walls were brick, not concrete, and they were slick with moisture. The tunnel extended in both directions, curving out of sight about 20 feet from the access point. Max was at her side again, his nose pointed directly down into the hole. His body language had changed, become more focused, more certain. Whatever had been in the hidden chamber was gone, but its trail led down, into the old tunnels, into the darkness beneath the darkness. "Collins," Chen said, "we need to call this in. This is bigger than a missing persons case. 18 victims, at minimum. This is a serial situation." Sarah nodded without looking up. She was watching Max, watching the way his muscles tensed, the way his ears pricked forward. He wanted to go down. Every instinct in his body was telling him to follow the trail, to find whatever had taken these people, and she wanted to follow him. But she also knew that rushing into unknown territory with limited information was how good officers got killed. "We clear the tunnel first," she said, "both ends. Make sure whatever we're dealing with can't get past us while we're underground. Then we map these utility tunnels and plan a systematic search." Chen nodded, relief flickering briefly across her face. She turned to her team and began issuing orders. Sarah stood at the edge of the hole, staring down into the blackness, and felt Max press against her leg once more. "We'll find them, boy," she said, so quietly that no one else could hear. "Whatever took them, wherever they are, we'll find them." The next 3 hours were a controlled chaos of activity. More officers arrived, along with engineers from the city's infrastructure department, who brought blueprints and historical records of the tunnel system that ran beneath this section of Atlanta. The Beltline bike tunnel had been built in 2012, constructed over and around a network of much older passages that dated back to the early 20th century. These tunnels were part of the original water and sewer infrastructure, a city engineer named Patterson explained, spreading yellowed drawings across a folding table in the command tent. Most of them were sealed off during the construction of the Beltline, filled with concrete or simply bricked up at the access points. But there were always gaps in the records, tunnels that were documented but never properly closed, passages that appeared on some maps but not others. Sarah studied the drawings, tracing the lines of old tunnels with her finger. The network was extensive, branching and interconnecting in ways that suggested organic growth rather than planned development. Some passages were large enough to walk through standing upright. Others were little more than crawl spaces, and many of them connected to buildings on the surface, to basements and sub-basements that had been part of Atlanta's commercial district for over a century. "Where do these tunnels lead?" she asked, pointing to a cluster of passages that seemed to converge about half a mile from the bike tunnel. Patterson leaned in to examine the section she indicated. "That's the old underground Atlanta area. Back in the 1920s and 30s, there was a whole network of tunnels connecting the businesses down there. When they raised the street level, a lot of those spaces were just sealed off and forgotten. There are stories about homeless populations living down there during the Depression, and again in the 1970s before the underground was redeveloped as a tourist attraction." Sarah exchanged a glance with Captain Webb, who had been listening from the corner of the tent. Stories about homeless populations, but the victims weren't homeless. They were ordinary people, cyclists and joggers, who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. "We need to clear those tunnels," she said, "all of them. But we can't just send people in blind. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Webb stepped forward. "What are you proposing? Max and I will conduct a preliminary reconnaissance. We'll map the tunnel system from the inside, mark any signs of habitation or activity, and identify the most likely areas where the victims might be held." "Held?" Chen asked from across the tent. "You think they're still alive?" Sarah looked at her with steady green eyes. The chamber under the bike tunnel had shoes but no bodies, no blood on the shoes, no signs of violence in that space. Whatever took these people, it's keeping them somewhere. And that means there's a chance, however small, that at least some of them are still alive. The tent was silent for a moment, everyone processing the implications. Then Webb nodded slowly. "You go in with a full tactical team," he said. "No solo operations." Sarah shook her head. "A full team will be too slow, too loud. Whatever we're dealing with knows these tunnels. It's been using them for who knows how long. Max and I can move faster and quieter than any team. We can find the trail before it goes cold. And if you find whatever took these people, then I call in the cavalry. But first, I need to find it." Webb stared at her for a long moment, then looked down at Max, who sat at Sarah's side with perfect stillness, his dark eyes fixed on the captain with an intelligence that was almost unsettling. "That dog of yours," Webb said finally. "He really as good as they say?" "Better," Sarah replied without hesitation. Webb sighed, rubbed his face with both hands, and nodded. 1 hour reconnaissance. You maintain radio contact at all times. If you find anything, you report immediately. No heroics, Collins. I want you both back in one piece." Sarah acknowledged the order and moved toward the tunnel entrance. The sun had shifted while they were planning, casting long shadows across the concrete. The heat was still brutal, but clouds were building on the horizon, promising a late afternoon thunderstorm. She paused at the threshold of the bike tunnel, checked her equipment one final time, and then stepped back into the darkness with Max at her side. They moved quickly through the main tunnel, past the breached wall and the hidden chamber, to the hole in the floor that led down to the old utility passages. Sarah had brought a climbing harness and rope, but as she examined the hole more closely, she saw that metal rungs had been set into the brick wall, forming a rough ladder that descended into the depths. The rungs were old, perhaps original to the tunnel construction a century ago, but they had been recently cleaned. The grime and corrosion that would have accumulated over decades had been scraped away, leaving the metal bright and functional. Someone had been using this access point regularly. She clipped a carabiner to her harness, attached the rope to a structural support in the chamber above, and began to descend. Max watched her go, whining softly, his front paws at the edge of the hole. When she reached the bottom, about 15 feet down, she called up to him, "Come on, boy. Easy." The Malinois didn't hesitate. He launched himself over the edge, twisting in mid-air with the fluid grace of his species, and landed beside her with barely a sound. Sarah caught him as he landed, steadying him, and felt the tension vibrating through his muscular frame. He was ready. Whatever waited in these tunnels, he was ready to find it. The utility tunnel was different from the modern bike tunnel above. The walls were red brick, darkened with age and moisture. The ceiling arched in a style that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. The floor was a mixture of packed earth and crumbling concrete, with channels cut along the edges that might once have carried water or sewage. The air was thick and damp, carrying odors of mold, rust, and something else, something organic. Max's nose was working overtime, processing the layers of scent that filled the tunnel. Sarah watched him move, saw the way he paused at certain points, doubled back, then proceeded with more certainty. He was building a picture of the environment, categorizing and prioritizing the information he was gathering. After a moment, he set off down the tunnel to the left, moving at a trot that Sarah matched easily. They traveled in silence for several minutes, the beam of Sarah's flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead. The tunnel branched and intersected with other passages, but Max always knew which way to go. He would pause briefly at each junction, nose to the ground or the air, then proceed without hesitation. His confidence was reassuring, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this darkness. At the first major intersection, Sarah paused to radio their position. "Command, this is Collins. We've descended to the utility level. Tunnel system matches the historical blueprints. Max is tracking a scent trail heading southwest toward the underground Atlanta area. No contact yet." Webb's voice came back, slightly distorted by the layers of brick and earth between them. "Copy that, Collins. We're tracking your position on GPS. Be advised, the storm is moving in faster than expected. You've got maybe 45 minutes before communications may be affected. Understood. Collins out." She pocketed the radio and looked down at Max, who was waiting patiently for her to finish. His ears were pricked forward, his attention fixed on the tunnel ahead. She gave him the hand signal to proceed, and they moved on. The tunnel system was more extensive than the blueprints had suggested. Some passages were exactly where the old maps indicated, but others appeared to be newer, carved out of the earth with tools rather than constructed with brick and mortar. These newer passages were narrower, the walls rough and unfinished, the ceilings low enough that Sarah had to duck in places. Max led her through this maze with unwavering confidence, his nose guiding them through turns and intersections that would have been impossible to navigate without him. The scent he was following must have been strong, because he never hesitated, never showed any doubt about their direction. After 20 minutes of travel, the tunnel opened into a larger space. A junction where 6 passages converged around a central chamber. Sarah swept her flashlight across the area and saw signs of habitation. Sleeping bags arranged in a rough circle, empty food cans stacked against one wall, a pile of clothing that looked like it had been gathered from multiple sources. And in the center of the chamber, a fire pit surrounded by stones, the ashes still warm when she touched them. "Someone lived here," she said into her radio. "Collins to command. I found a habitation site. Appears to be recently occupied. No sign of the missing persons yet." Webb's response was broken with static. "Copy? Collins? Careful." The storm must be interfering with communications already. Sarah keyed the radio again, but got only white noise in response. She was on her own. Max had moved away from the fire pit, his nose leading him toward one of the 6 passages that branched off from the central chamber. This one was different from the others, the entrance marked with scratches on the wall that formed a rough pattern. Not random gouges like the ones in the hidden chamber under the bike tunnel, but deliberate marks that might have been symbols or a primitive form of writing. Sarah photographed the marks with her phone, then followed Max into the passage. This tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, taking them deeper into the earth. The air grew colder and damper, and the smell that had been present since they descended became stronger. Organic decay mixed with something chemical, something that reminded Sarah of a hospital. The passage ended at a metal door, heavily rusted but recently used, based on the clean swing arc on the floor. Max stood before it, his nose pressed to the gap at the bottom, his tail held low and rigid. He made that sound again, the rumbling that wasn't quite a growl, and Sarah felt her hand tighten on her weapon. She tried the handle. The door was unlocked. With a deep breath, she pushed it open and stepped through, her flashlight beam cutting into whatever lay beyond. And then she stopped, her heart seeming to freeze in her chest as her brain struggled to process what she was seeing. The room on the other side of the door was large, perhaps 50 feet square, with ceilings that rose to an arched peak about 20 feet overhead. The walls were lined with hospital beds, old ones with metal frames and thin mattresses, arranged in rows that filled most of the available space, and on those beds, strapped down with leather restraints, were people. Sarah counted quickly. 15 people in various states of consciousness, some awake and staring at her with desperate eyes, others seemingly asleep or unconscious. They were connected to IV lines that ran to bags of clear fluid hanging from makeshift stands. Their clothes had been removed and replaced with hospital gowns, and their shoes, she realized now, had been taken as trophies. She moved into the room, her flashlight sweeping across the faces of the victims. She recognized the woman from the second missing person report, the personal trainer with the running shoes. The woman's eyes were open, tracking Sarah's movements, but she seemed unable to speak. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. "It's okay," Sarah said, her voice barely steady. "I'm police. I'm here to help." She keyed her radio, knowing it was probably useless, but trying anyway. "Command, this is Collins. I found the victims. Repeat, I found the victims. 15 individuals, alive but incapacitated. I need immediate medical and tactical support at my location. Static. Nothing but static." Max had moved to the far end of the room, where another door stood partially open. His body language had changed again, becoming more aggressive, his hackles rising slightly along his spine. Whatever he smelled beyond that door was not another victim. It was the thing that had put these people here. Sarah moved toward him, keeping her weapon raised, her flashlight beam steady. She could hear something now beyond the door, that rhythmic sound she had noticed earlier. The pumping or breathing that seemed to fill the tunnels. It was louder here, more distinct. She reached Max's side and peered through the gap in the door. Beyond it was another corridor, shorter than the others, that ended in a room filled with equipment. Medical equipment, she realized. Old machines that looked like they had been scavenged from hospitals or medical supply companies. Dialysis machines, blood pressure monitors, EKG units. And at the center of it all, connected to tubes and wires that ran to the other room, was a larger machine that Sarah didn't recognize. It was the source of the rhythmic sound, a pump of some kind, with clear chambers that showed liquid being circulated through the system. The liquid was red, blood. They were harvesting blood. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. Someone had created a blood harvesting operation in the tunnels beneath Atlanta, using the homeless population and anyone else unlucky enough to wander into their trap. The victims in the other room weren't just being held captive. They were being used as living blood banks, kept alive to provide a continuous supply. A sound behind her made her spin, her weapon coming up, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. A figure stood in the doorway through which she had entered, silhouetted against the dim light from the tunnel beyond. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a surgical gown. His face was obscured by a medical mask, but his eyes were visible above it, pale and cold and utterly without empathy. "You shouldn't be here," the man said. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, as if he were discussing the weather. "The supply chain must be maintained." Sarah kept her weapon trained on him, her finger on the trigger. "Atlanta Police, you're under arrest. Get on the ground, now." The man didn't move. "The supply chain," he repeated, as if she hadn't spoken. "Do you understand what that means? The hospitals, the clinics, the emergency rooms, they all need blood. But the donors, they're never enough. Never enough to meet the demand. Someone has to fill the gap." Sarah's mind raced. A black market blood operation, sophisticated enough to keep victims alive for extended harvesting, connected somehow to medical facilities that needed supply. It was monstrous, but it was also logical in a twisted way. Blood was always in short supply. Someone had found a way to meet that demand through the worst possible means. "This is over," she said. "Whatever you've built here, it's done. More officers are on the way." The man tilted his head, studying her with those pale, empty eyes. "You brought the dog," he said, as if noticing Max for the first time. "Clever animal. He found the chamber, didn't he? Found the entrance. I knew the shoes were a risk. Trophies always are, but I couldn't resist. Each pair represents a life sustained, a patient saved. 18 donors have provided enough blood to save over 100 lives. The math is simple. The math is murder," Sarah said. "Get on the ground. I won't ask again." The man smiled behind his mask. She could see the creasing around his eyes, the suggestion of amusement. "You won't shoot me," he said. "Not when I'm the only one who knows how to operate the extraction system. Kill me and all 15 of them die. Their blood types, their medication schedules, the anticoagulants keeping them alive. It's all in here." He tapped his temple with one gloved finger. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't lower her weapon. Max was at her side now, his focus locked on the man in the doorway, his body coiled and ready. She could feel the tension radiating off him, the predatory energy waiting to be unleashed. "You're going to step aside," she said, "and let me pass. Then you're going to lie face down on the ground with your hands behind your head. Whatever deals need to be made, whatever information you think you have, we can discuss it after you're in custody." The man's smile faded. "I don't think so." He moved then, faster than Sarah would have expected, his hand coming up from behind his back with something metallic glinting in the dim light. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could fire, Max was airborne. The Malinois hit the man in the chest with over 70 pounds of muscle and fury, driving him backward into the tunnel wall. The metallic object, a scalpel, went flying into the darkness. The man screamed as Max's jaws clamped onto his forearm, the dog's teeth sinking through the surgical gown and into flesh. Sarah was on them in seconds, her knee in the man's back, her handcuffs out and clicking around his wrists, even as he thrashed and screamed beneath her. Max released his grip at her command, stepping back but remaining alert, blood on his muzzle, his eyes never leaving the prone figure on the ground. "Stay," Sarah said to the man, her voice hard as steel. "Move again," and I let him finish what he started. The man went still, his breathing ragged, his pale eyes now showing something that might have been fear. Sarah keyed her radio one more time, and this time, miraculously, she got a response. "Collins, read you." "Status, suspect in custody," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. 15 victims located, alive but in need of immediate medical attention. I'm in a sub-level chamber approximately half a mile southwest of the bike tunnel, near the old underground Atlanta area. I need everything you've got down here, now. The next several hours were a blur of activity that Sarah would later struggle to remember in precise detail. Tactical teams flooded the tunnel system, following the path she had marked. Paramedics arrived in waves, carefully disconnecting the victims from the blood-harvesting equipment and stabilizing them for transport. Engineers from the city worked to map and secure the entire network of passages, discovering in the process that it was even more extensive than anyone had realized. The man Sarah had apprehended was identified as Dr. Marcus Webb, no relation to the captain, a former hematologist who had lost his medical license 8 years earlier after being accused of unethical experimentation. He had apparently been building his underground operation for the better part of a decade, starting with homeless victims whose disappearances went unreported and gradually becoming bolder as his system was refined. The blood, investigations would later reveal, had been sold to black market medical suppliers who asked no questions about its origin. It had been used in surgeries, transfusions, and medical research across the southeastern United States. Hundreds of people had unknowingly received blood from victims who were being held captive beneath Atlanta's streets. Sarah sat outside the tunnel entrance as the last of the victims was brought up on a stretcher, the woman she had recognized earlier, the personal trainer. The woman's eyes found Sarah's face and held there, and though she still couldn't speak, her gratitude was clear in her expression. She reached out a weak hand, and Sarah took it, squeezing gently. "You're safe now," Sarah said. "It's over." The woman nodded once, then closed her eyes as the paramedics carried her toward the waiting ambulance. Max sat beside Sarah, his muzzle cleaned of blood, his body finally relaxed after hours of tension. He leaned against her leg, and she rested her hand on his head, feeling the warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. The storm had passed while they were underground, leaving the air cool and fresh, the asphalt dark with rain. The Beltline was still closed, the bike tunnel still a crime scene, but the echo that had driven officers to retreat had been silenced. The darkness beneath the city had given up its secrets. Captain Webb approached, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "Hell of a day, Collins." Sarah nodded without looking up. Her eyes were on the sunset, visible between the buildings to the west, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink. "Any word on the victims' prognoses?" Webb consulted his tablet. "All 15 are stable. Severe anemia, dehydration, muscle atrophy from prolonged immobilization, but the doctors say they should all make full recoveries. Physically, anyway. The psychological trauma is going to take longer." Sarah absorbed this information in silence. 18 pairs of shoes in that chamber, but only 15 living victims. The other 3, the earliest ones taken, hadn't survived the harvesting process. Their bodies had been disposed of somewhere in the tunnel system, and the search was ongoing. "I want to be there when they're found," she said. "The ones who didn't make it. Their families deserve closure." Webb nodded. "I'll make sure you're notified." He paused, then added, "You did good work today, Collins, both of you." He glanced at Max, who lifted his head to meet the captain's eyes with that unsettling intelligence. Webb held the gaze for a moment, then shook his head and walked away. Sarah stayed where she was, watching the sunset fade and the streetlights flicker on. The city was coming back to life around her, people emerging from their air-conditioned refuges now that the heat of the day had broken. They walked dogs and pushed strollers, jogged and cycled along the portions of the Beltline that remained open. They had no idea what had been lurking beneath their feet, what darkness had been feeding on the unwary for years. But that was the nature of evil, Sarah reflected. It hid in the shadows, in the places people didn't want to look. It thrived on ignorance and complacency, and it was the job of people like her and partners like Max to drag it into the light. She stood, stretching muscles that had stiffened during the long day. Max rose with her, his tail wagging slightly, his eyes bright despite his obvious fatigue. "Come on, boy," she said, "let's go home." They walked together toward her car, leaving behind the tunnel entrance with its fluttering crime scene tape and its secrets finally exposed. Tomorrow there would be reports to file and interviews to conduct and a trial to prepare for. Tomorrow the work would continue. But tonight there was only the cool evening air, the faithful presence of her partner at her side, and the satisfaction of knowing that the echoes from the darkness would never force anyone to retreat again. The drive home was quiet, the streets of Atlanta slipping past in a blur of headlights and neon. Sarah kept the windows down, letting the post-storm breeze flow through the car, ruffling Max's fur where he sat in the back seat. He had his head out the window, nose working even now, cataloguing the thousands of scents that made up the nighttime city. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Webb. Preliminary interviews with the victims are yielding more information. Dr. Webb, the suspect, had accomplices, at least 2 others who helped with the operation. We're pulling surveillance footage from the area, cross-referencing with anyone who had access to the tunnel system. This isn't over. She read the message at a red light, her jaw tightening. Of course there were accomplices. An operation that sophisticated couldn't have been run by one man alone. Someone had to monitor the victims, maintain the equipment, transport the blood to buyers. The network extended beyond the tunnels, into the legitimate world above. She typed a quick response. "Keep me informed. I want to be part of the takedown." The light changed and she drove on. Her apartment was in a quiet neighborhood in Decatur, a ground-floor unit with a small fenced yard where Max could run. She pulled into the driveway, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the darkness, processing the events of the day. The victims' faces haunted her. 15 people strapped to beds, their blood being drained in a macabre parody of medical care. They would carry the trauma of that experience for the rest of their lives. And somewhere out there, the families of the 3 who hadn't survived were still waiting for news, still hoping against hope. Max whined softly from the back seat, and Sarah shook off her dark thoughts. She opened the door, let him out, and followed him into the yard. He immediately began a patrol of the perimeter, checking for any changes since they had left that morning. It was a routine he performed every time they came home, a combination of instinct and training that made him as much a guardian as a partner. Sarah unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was small but comfortable, decorated with photographs from her years on the force and a few pieces of art she had picked up at local galleries. The kitchen was clean, the bed made, everything in its place. Order amid chaos, a counterbalance to the darkness she dealt with daily. She poured water for Max and food for herself, a reheated container of leftover Thai from 2 days ago. They ate together in comfortable silence, then moved to the couch where Sarah turned on the news. The story of the Beltline tunnel was already breaking, anchors with serious expressions describing the rescue of 15 victims from an underground blood harvesting operation. She watched until they started showing file footage of the tunnel entrance, the yellow tape she had walked past that morning. Then she turned off the TV and sat in the darkness, Max's head heavy on her lap, his breathing slow and steady. The phone buzzed again. Webb. We've identified one of the accomplices, a nurse from Grady Memorial. She was on shift when the blood was delivered and processed. We're bringing her in now. Sarah felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. The network was unraveling. The people who had participated in this horror, who had profited from it, would be held accountable. Justice was slow, but it was coming. She typed her response. Good. Let me know if you need me for interrogation. She set the phone aside and let her head fall back against the couch cushions. Exhaustion was catching up with her, the adrenaline of the day finally draining away. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the chamber with its rows of beds, the IV lines dripping, the pump circulating stolen blood through its transparent chambers. Max sensed her distress and lifted his head, his dark eyes finding hers in the dimness. He made a soft sound, not quite a whine, more like a question. Are you okay? She ran her fingers through the fur on his neck, feeling the strength beneath. I'm okay, boy. We did good today. We got them out. The dog held her gaze for a moment longer, then settled his head back down on her lap with a sigh. Within minutes, his breathing had slowed to the rhythm of sleep. Sarah stayed awake a while longer, watching shadows move across the ceiling as cars passed outside, listening to the normal sounds of the city at night. Eventually, she drifted off, her hand still resting on Max's head, her partner's warmth a comfort against the memory of the cold tunnels beneath the earth. The morning came too soon, grey light filtering through the blinds, the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the coffee table. Sarah opened her eyes, disoriented for a moment, then sat up and grabbed the phone. Webb. They have a lead on the second accomplice, a man who worked for the city's infrastructure department. He had access to the tunnel blueprints, helped the operation stay hidden for years. We're moving in now. I want you there. She was on her feet before she finished reading, moving toward the bedroom to change. Max was already at the door, his body language telling her he knew something was happening. She dressed quickly, clipped on her badge, and holstered her weapon, and within 5 minutes they were in the car, heading toward the address Webb had provided. It was a warehouse in the industrial district near the airport, a low brick building with boarded-up windows and a faded sign advertising Atlanta Industrial Supply. The tactical team was already in position when Sarah arrived, black-clad figures moving into place around the perimeter. Webb met her at the command vehicle. The accomplice's name is Raymond Chen. He's been employed by the city for 18 years, has complete access to underground infrastructure maps and maintenance schedules. We believe he's been coordinating the transportation of victims from the tunnel to this location before they were moved to the holding chamber. Sarah looked at the warehouse, its dark windows and rusted doors. Any idea how many people are inside? Thermal imaging shows at least 3 heat signatures, Chen and possibly 2 others. We don't know if they're victims or additional accomplices. Max was straining against his harness, his nose pointed toward the warehouse, his entire body vibrating with focus. He smelled something significant. He's got a scent, Sarah said. Might be one of the victims, might be the blood. Either way, he wants in. Webb nodded. We go in 2 minutes. Chen is armed according to his records, licensed for a handgun. Treat this as a hostile situation. The 2 minutes passed in tense silence. Sarah checked her weapon one final time, adjusted Max's harness, and moved into position near the front entrance. The tactical team was spread around the building, ready to breach simultaneously from multiple points. On my mark, Webb's voice came through the radio. 3, 2, 1, execute. The door in front of Sarah exploded inward, the tactical ram making short work of the rusted hinges. She was through the opening before the dust had settled, Max beside her, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom of the warehouse interior. The space was vast and mostly empty, the concrete floor stained with oil and debris. Metal shelving units lined the walls, holding boxes and equipment that had been abandoned years ago. And at the far end of the building, partially concealed behind a stack of crates, was a man with a gun. "Police! Drop your weapon!" Sarah shouted, her own weapon trained on him. The man hesitated, his face pale in the beam of her flashlight. He was older than she expected, with grey hair and deep lines around his eyes. He looked tired, defeated, like a man who knew his time had run out. "It's over. Raymond," Sarah said, her voice steady, "there's nowhere to go. Put the gun down." For a long moment, no one moved. The tension in the warehouse was palpable, thick enough to taste. Sarah could hear the tactical team moving into position behind her, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She could feel Max beside her, coiled and ready, waiting for her command. Then Raymond Chen lowered his weapon, set it on the ground, and raised his hands. The takedown was clean after that. Chen was cuffed and led away, and the tactical team moved to clear the rest of the building. They found 2 more people, both victims, a man and a woman who had been scheduled for transport to the underground chamber that morning. They were disoriented but unharmed, and paramedics rushed them to the hospital for evaluation. Sarah stayed to supervise the processing of the scene, watching as forensic technicians documented every piece of evidence. The warehouse had been a way station, a place where victims were held temporarily before being moved underground. Restraints, medical supplies, and empty blood bags were found throughout the building. The scope of the operation was even larger than they had initially believed. Webb approached her as the sun rose higher, casting harsh light through the broken windows. "That's 2 down," he said, "the nurse and the infrastructure guy. Still looking for any others who might have been involved." Sarah nodded, her eyes following Max as he moved through the warehouse, still cataloguing scents, still building his picture of what had happened here. "The victims we found," she said, "are they talking?" "The ones from the underground chamber, yes." Webb consulted his phone. "They're providing detailed descriptions of everyone who had access to them. Guards, technicians, the doctor. We're building a complete picture of the organization." Organization. Sarah turned the word over in her mind. That's what this was. An organization, a network, a system designed to harvest blood from unwilling donors and sell it on the black market. It required planning, infrastructure, and most of all, it required people who were willing to look at another human being as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. "What about buyers?" she asked. "Who was purchasing the blood?" Webb's expression darkened. "That's going to take longer. The supply chain was deliberately obscured. Multiple intermediaries, shell companies, offshore accounts. We've got federal agencies involved now. This is going to be a long investigation." Sarah looked at Max, who had finished his survey of the warehouse and was now sitting at her feet, his eyes fixed on her face. The dog understood more than people gave him credit for. He knew when a case was closed and when it was just beginning. "I want to stay on it," she said, "however long it takes." Webb nodded. "I figured you would." He glanced at Max. "Both of you." They left the warehouse as the forensic teams continued their work, stepping into the morning sun that was already warming the pavement. The industrial district was coming to life around them. Trucks and workers and the rhythms of commerce that continued regardless of the darkness that lurked beneath. Sarah loaded Max into the car and sat for a moment before starting the engine. In the rearview mirror, she could see the warehouse receding, one piece of the puzzle that was slowly coming together. There would be more arrests, more evidence to process, more victims to identify and counsel. The work was far from over, but for now there was a moment of quiet satisfaction. 15 people had been saved, a monstrous operation had been exposed, and the echoes from the darkness had been silenced, replaced by the sounds of justice being served. She started the car and drove toward the precinct, Max in the back seat, the morning sun warm on her face. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new darkness to confront, but today they had won. Today the good guys had dragged the monsters into the light, and that was enough. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity that blurred together in Sarah's memory. The investigation into the blood harvesting ring expanded exponentially as each arrested accomplice led to new leads. Federal agencies became involved, their resources dwarfing those of the local police department. Sarah found herself navigating a complex web of bureaucracy and jurisdiction while trying to maintain focus on what mattered most: the victims. There were 23 of them in total, once all were accounted for. 18 who had survived the ordeal in the underground chamber, and 5 more who had been intercepted at various waypoints before transport. The 3 who had died were eventually located in an abandoned section of the tunnel system, their remains treated with as much dignity as the forensic requirements allowed. Sarah attended every funeral, standing in the back of churches and graveyards while families wept for loved ones whose deaths had been so senseless. Max stayed home during these visits, his presence too conspicuous for the somber occasions, but he was always there when she returned, pressing against her leg as if he understood her need for comfort. The survivors faced a long road to recovery: physical therapy for muscles atrophied by weeks of immobility, blood transfusions to replace what had been taken from them, and psychological counseling to process the trauma of captivity and violation. Sarah visited them when she could, bringing flowers or simply sitting with them while they talked about what they had endured. One survivor, the personal trainer whose face Sarah had recognized in the underground chamber, became something of a spokesperson for the group. Her name was Elena Vargas, and she had been held for 6 weeks before the rescue. She gave interviews to news outlets, speaking with remarkable composure about the horror she had experienced and the gratitude she felt toward the officers who had saved her. Sarah watched one of these interviews on television late one night, Max asleep on the floor beside her. Elena was describing the moment when she first saw the flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the chamber, when she understood that someone had finally come for them. "I thought I was going to die there," Elena said, her voice steady but her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I thought no one would ever find us. And then this woman and her dog came through the door, and I knew we were going to be okay." The interviewer asked about the investigation, about the scope of the operation that had been uncovered. Elena shook her head, a flash of anger crossing her face. "I don't care about the organization," she said. "I care about the people who saved us. Lieutenant Collins and Max, they're the ones who matter. They walked into that darkness without knowing what they would find, and they brought us back into the light." Sarah turned off the television and sat in silence for a long moment. Max stirred at her feet, lifting his head to look at her with those dark, intelligent eyes. She reached down and scratched behind his ears. "She's right, you know," Sarah said softly. "We did bring them back." Max's tail thumped against the floor once, twice, then he settled back down with a contented sigh. The trial of Dr. Marcus Webb, the mastermind behind the blood harvesting operation, began 3 months after his arrest. Sarah testified on the first day, describing her discovery of the hidden chamber, the confrontation in the tunnels, and the arrest. The defense attorney tried to shake her testimony, to suggest that she had acted recklessly, that she had endangered the victims by pursuing the investigation alone. Sarah remained calm under the pressure, answering each question with measured precision. She described Max's role in tracking the scent trail, in alerting her to the hidden entrance, in subduing the suspect when he attacked. The jury listened with rapt attention, their eyes moving from Sarah to Max, who sat in the gallery next to Captain Webb. "The defendant threatened to kill all 15 victims if I didn't comply with his demands," Sarah said, her voice steady. "My partner incapacitated him before he could carry out that threat. In my assessment, his actions saved lives." The defense attorney attempted to argue that a police dog should not be characterized as having saved lives, that it was merely responding to training. But the jury had seen the photographs of the underground chamber, had heard the testimony of the survivors. They understood what Max had done. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Dr. Webb was convicted on 23 counts of kidnapping, 18 counts of assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, and 3 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The accomplices received sentences ranging from 15 years to life, depending on their level of involvement. Raymond Chen, the infrastructure employee, cooperated with authorities and received a reduced sentence of 20 years. The nurse from Grady Memorial, whose name was Patricia Holbrook, maintained her innocence until the end and received 30 years. The buyers of the blood were harder to prosecute. Many of them had been unwitting participants in the operation, purchasing blood through legitimate-seeming medical supply companies without knowing its origin. But those who had been aware of the nature of the supply chain faced federal charges for trafficking in human biological materials. Through it all, Sarah and Max continued their work. There were other cases, other criminals, other victims who needed their help. The Beltline tunnel eventually reopened, the hidden chamber sealed with concrete, the murals on the walls restored. Life in Atlanta went on, as it always did. But Sarah never forgot those weeks of darkness, the faces of the survivors, the echoes that had forced officers to retreat. She kept a photograph on her desk of the 15 people she had rescued, taken during a reunion event organized by Elena Vargas. They stood together, smiling, some of them still pale from their ordeal, but all of them alive. And in the center of the group, receiving more attention than any of the humans, was Max. He had become something of a celebrity after the case. Local news outlets ran features on the K-9 unit, focusing on the role he had played in solving one of the most disturbing crimes in Atlanta's recent history. Children sent him letters and drawings. A local bakery created a dog treat called the Max in his honor. Sarah took the attention in stride, deflecting praise to her partner whenever possible. "He's the one with the nose," she would say. "I just follow where he leads." But she knew it was more than that. The partnership between them was based on trust, on years of training and experience, on a bond that went deeper than words could express. Max followed her because she had earned his loyalty, and she trusted him because he had never let her down. One evening, about a year after the tunnel case, Sarah sat on the porch of a new house she had purchased in a quieter neighborhood. The yard was larger here, with plenty of room for Max to run. He lay beside her chair, his graying muzzle resting on his paws, his eyes half closed in contentment. "You're getting older, boy," Sarah said, running her fingers through his fur. "We both are." Max's tail twitched, but he didn't open his eyes. Sarah looked out at the darkening sky, the first stars beginning to appear. In a few years, Max would retire from active duty. A younger dog would take his place, and Sarah would have to build a new partnership from the ground up. The thought was bittersweet, but that was the future. Tonight, there was only the quiet peace of a summer evening, the presence of her loyal partner, and the satisfaction of a job well done. The echoes from the darkness had been silenced, and the light had prevailed. And tomorrow, there would be new cases, new challenges, new darkness to confront. But Sarah Collins and K-9 Max would face them together as they always had, because that was what partners did. They walked into the darkness, and they brought each other back out.